My name's Andrew White. I direct the Center for New York City Affairs here at the Milano School. In addition to directing the center, I teach politics and media and sort of the politics of policy, I should say, sort of implementation and all the issues related to how do you make policy ideals become some form of reality. They're often not ideal, but it's close. At the center, we combine investigative and explanatory journalism, policy research, and data analysis to produce cutting-edge studies on the city's public schools, on child welfare services, on community building, and on several other issues. There's a few examples of our work out on the table. We also collaborate with a wide range of organizations to drive meaningful innovations in government policy. And you can read much more about our work on our website at centernyc.org. We're dedicated to learning about what works for families on the ground and in the city's neighborhoods, and we try our best to take those lessons and lift them up into the public sphere. I want to thank the Cyrus Fund and the Milano Foundation for making this event possible. And I also wanted to thank Sam Marks of Deutsche Bank and Sarah Rosen of JP Morgan, who I believe are here, for their support of the center. For those of you who are new to our programs, you should know that we frequently host forums like this one about the issues facing city neighborhoods and about the politics of local and state government. My guess is we'll do something fairly soon on the so-called politics of state government. We had to go through this 2 years ago. Looks like we're going through some more chaos. I'm not sure yet what we'll be able to do in terms of sort of public discussion around Albany reforms, but there's a lot to talk about, so keep your eyes open for that. And make sure you've signed in so that we have your name on our email blast lists. All of this work fits with the fundamentals of a Milano school education. At Milano, we work very hard to bridge the gap between academic theory and practice. We involve our students in hands-on policy work from their very first month here. We engage them directly with organizations and agencies working to create change, both locally and internationally, and I assume with some of your organizations as well. Our students leave here with a firm footing in the professional world of policy and management, as well as a profound understanding of the forces of politics and implementation, forces that ultimately decide what's actually possible and what's improbable. One of the most difficult problems facing New York today and for the last 30 years has been our stubbornly high poverty rate. In many parts of the city, the government has catalyzed major investments in housing, major improvements in the housing stock. We've organized and supported a remarkable array of human services, childcare programs, youth development programs, and even made progress in improving the education system. And New York has become a safer city than any of us really can remember in our lifetime. And yet, well over 1/4 of children under 18 in this city live in families with incomes below the federal poverty line. Young children with young moms are even more likely to be very poor. And by the estimates of hunger advocates, most of these poor families must rely at least some of the time on soup kitchens and food pantries to get by. What's more, child obesity remains an especially challenging problem in poor and working class communities in New York. The public schools are one of the few places where we can actually make a connection with city kids almost every day, and in many cases with their families. So school food matters. So much of our work here at Milano crosses traditional boundaries and weaves people together from different fields. Linking public schools with issues of hunger and obesity seems logical, but in government it means linking education with social welfare, with agriculture, with public health, and beyond. This kind of linkage and sort of multifaceted approach to an issue is personified by our lead speaker this morning. 2 years ago, I was working on a study of community partnerships for the prevention of child abuse. And I spent a week in and around Des Moines, Iowa, which has one of the more extraordinary public child protective service agencies in the country. And guess who was that agency's director? Kevin Concannon. When Iowa's former governor, Tom Vilsack, went to Washington to join the Obama administration as Agriculture Secretary, I guess he was clear that whoever took leadership on nutrition issues in his department would have to have a non-traditional background. And he found his man. After Undersecretary Concannon gives his opening talk, we'll invite our panelists up to the front of the room for a conversation. And towards the end of the program, we'll involve you all in the discussion. The way that's going to work is we'll have a couple of people walking around with microphones. You'll hold your hands up. They'll check in with you and hand you the mic, and our moderator will call on you. So be thinking as people are talking up here about what you'd like to ask. Kevin Concannon has served as Undersecretary for Food, Nutrition, and Consumer Services in the U.S. Department of Agriculture since July 2009. Over the past 25 years, Undersecretary Concannon has served as the Director of State Health and Human Services Departments in Maine, Oregon, and Iowa. He's covered most of this country. And he really has been a leader in innovation, particularly in child welfare and child and family policy. So it is especially interesting to me to see how he is taking on the issues we're here to talk about today. Mr. Concannon.
Thank you very much. It is a special honor to be here today at the new school to meet with all of you and to participate with colleagues who are deeply committed, involved in anti-hunger and doing a better job with feeding America's children and adults. We meet at a time, this is National Nutrition Month, if that's one of those little items you may or may not be aware of, School Breakfast Week, believe it or not. And it's very important in the life cycle of public policy. This is a week in which both yesterday the Secretary of Agriculture testified before the U.S. Senate. I'm going to be before a House committee tomorrow. And these are the opportune times we have to move forward in terms of public issues and public policy. But I want to start with crediting, I have a button here that I have been gifted by the Food Research and Action Center. They very adroitly and early, after the President declared about a year ago a commitment to end childhood hunger by 2015, the Food Research and Action Center, FRAC, started distributing these buttons. And Jim Weil, whom you're going to hear from later on, their top person, invariably usually gives me one of these buttons when we appear. Today I had the good opportunity to give him one, so we swap them back and forth. But it's a reminder to us. It's more than just a button. It's a reminder that we have a very ambitious goal to reach for the country by 2015. And one of the major pillars to accomplish that goal can be done through the child and can be achieved through the child nutrition programs, the school lunch, school breakfast, summer feeding programs, the child and adult care feeding programs. These are components, and the WIC program, these are the components within the Child Nutrition Reauthorization. And every 5 years, federally, bills such as the child nutrition programs are reauthorized. They are both in terms of policy and funding sort of reconstituted. And this is the year we have that opportunity, so it's one about which I'm very excited. We want a robust reauthorization of that Child Nutrition Act. And as I say, it is one of the most important pillars if we are really going to end childhood hunger in this country. The President took office now a little more than a year ago with really unparalleled challenges coming his way immediately. You know, huge debt, 2 wars, you know, an economy that was collapsing. And he took steps immediately, and among the most important steps he took were the stimulus programs, the authorization for funds that went in various arenas to try to bolster the economy and respond to the many, many challenges Americans were facing. And in the food nutrition area, it took very important steps, some of which are in the child nutrition arena, But one of the most important, I'm not going to speak at length about it today, is the SNAP or the food stamp program. I say that in passing because it shouldn't be overlooked. It is one of the most comprehensive ways in which we respond to Americans. The food stamp program or the SNAP program currently serves more than 38 million Americans each month, half of whom are children, 12 months of the year. And that 38 million represents, that has been rising significantly, particularly over the past 3 years, reflecting the economy. And these programs, to the extent that states like New York State, cities like New York City, do a better job of enrolling the eligible residents of these states and cities, that has an implication, a very positive implication, for child nutrition programs, for school-based programs. So think of the 15 nutrition programs that are operated and supported by the U.S. Department of Agriculture as a suite of food and nutrition programs that relate to one another. They're not really separate and freestanding. They really have implications for one another. I say that in passing. Well, let me talk about the sort of problem statement, if you will, a problem definition. The USDA released a report back in November that showed some 16.7 million American children were living in households that had difficulty providing food to those children. The sanitary, the polite term is that these were households that were facing, resource problems. They were households in which children frequently experienced hunger. And that USDA, as I say, release went out in November. Well, shortly thereafter, the New York Times, Jason DePaul and a colleague at the Times did the first of a series of very powerful stories on the reliance on food stamps or the supplemental nutrition programs across the country. And subsequently and more recently, the Food Research and Action Center, FRAC, and Feeding America, the coalition of 200-plus food banks in the country, basically released their respective reports, all of which, without doing any injustice to them, underscore the phenomena of hunger in our country. And so I think there's lots of evidence from both from an anecdotal person-to-person experience, but also from broad studies and surveys that hunger exists in our midst. And yet, it's something we can do something about. It is something we can solve. It's not just a political or a public policy issue. It's really a moral issue for the country. And we are committed to meeting the President's goal. We are energetically committed to it. And we recognize the topic of today's meeting, the child nutrition programs, again, are one of the major opportunities, systemic opportunities we have to solve this problem. The Journal of Pediatrics, just this month, released several stories, several articles, rather, on obesity in our country, because we have the paradox of hunger and obesity that coexist, and they're related to one another. They're not indifferent to one another. And the Journal, the Pediatrics Journal, pointed out that they did a study, one of the studies referenced, spoke to the issue of very young children and the risk factors associated with being overweight and really from the earliest days in a person's life heading down the path of being of suffering with obesity and all that goes with it later on. And it'll come as no surprise to people here that the first risk factor associated is poverty. And just as was introduced in those remarks framing today, we have persistent poverty in the country, persistent poverty both in rural and in urban areas, and we need to do something about it. And I tend to view the nutrition and the feeding programs as sort of in the middle of that range, that we have poverty issues here, we really need to deal with those issues as a country. We have feeding opportunities, feeding programs in the middle of it. One, we can't overlook the fact that programs like TANF, I administered that program in 3 states, AFDC at one time, it has a bearing on it. Our employment policies have a bearing on it. Our tax policies, our EITC, these various other supports impinge or mitigate the circumstances of poverty. But feeding, importantly, starts with, and this is where I want to speak to the child nutrition programs. The WIC program, the Women, Infants, and Children program, is one of the program areas, again, that to me is one of the most effective and efficacious programs Food and Nutrition Service offers. You may not be aware of the fact that that's a targeted program for pregnant women, for breastfeeding, for young infants and children up to age 5. And nearly half of the births in the United States, nearly half of the births, the moms are in the WIC program. Nearly half of the infants, I think it's 49% of infants in the U.S. up to their first birthday, participate in the WIC program. The Food Nutrition Service, since it was a little factoid, purchases half of the infant formula in the United States, half of it. So the reason I mention that is one of the most, and WIC program just this past fall, all states in the country, and actually New York was a leader in implementing a new, healthier food package. More fruits, more vegetables, more whole grains, and better dairy in terms of health. And so we start kids off in the right way. There's lots of evidence about the efficacy of the WIC program. And I tend to then think, okay, in addition to that, you need to make sure that we have provided access to the SNAP or to the food stamp program as it's still known in New York State as well. Well, our priorities for the child nutrition reauthorization are to improve access, to improve the nutritional quality of these programs, to help directly address hunger among children, and to be supportive with, very directly supportive with the First Lady Michelle Obama's recently announced initiatives, Let's Move, a goal to end and seriously reduce obesity among children within a generation. The USDA feeding programs now touch 1 in 4 Americans over the course of the year. And a quick rundown of those numbers I mentioned already. 38 million Americans on the SNAP or the food stamp program at last count and rising, half of whom are children. Each day across the country, school days that is, 31.5 million children have lunch in schools, public and private. About 11.5 million children have breakfast at school, and that's one of our challenges. As you've heard, big gap between 31.5 million and 11.5 million, and an even larger gap exists in the summer. We know among that food insecurity or hunger periods that often that occurs in the summertime when children are out of school. So we have 31.5 million children having lunch at school, more than half of them having a free lunch based on income. And you say, well, do the math quickly, that's at least 16 or 17 million children. What happens to those children in the summertime, that 9 or 10-week period? We have 2.5 million children in those summer feeding programs. So we have a huge gap there, and we're actually sponsoring a webinar later today trying to encourage more organizations to respond and to participate. But that's one of the program areas that the Congress will be looking at in the child nutrition reauthorization. The principles we are promoting in that reauthorization in our dialogue with Congress, both houses, improved access, modernization, improved nutrition, nutrition education, and program integrity. It's a historic year this year for those programs. We're very excited about it. We want to improve the nutritional quality in school meals just as a starter. And USDA contracted with the Institute of Medicine of the National Academy of Science. They brought together a panel that met over a year-plus period made up of pediatricians, nutritionists, other specialists, lots of experience. And they made recommendations to us to improve the quality of school meals. You know, more fruits, vegetables, more whole grains, less fat, less salt, less sugar in those meals. And I view that, I get asked questions often about the SNAP or the food stamp program, and I say the way for us as a country to really address, to me, systematically, better eating habits is to incorporate these principles systematically and robustly in school meal programs across the country. So we want to better align our school meals with the dietary guidelines for all Americans. We want to support funding to improve school kitchens, to improve the training of school service, food service professionals. We want to improve the wellness policies that schools have now across the country. And we want to strengthen the linkage between local farmers and school cafeterias. I met, and I see one of those chefs in the room today, met with several chefs earlier this week, who not only are doing great things in their school feeding programs, but have engaged regional farmers so that we are purchasing more foods that are grown locally rather than shipping across the country from California or Florida. And that has a number of benefits. It isn't just fresher local foods, it helps the local economy, but it's a way to connect children during their impressionable years with knowing this is where food comes from, this is what it's all about, this is what's healthy for you. And we've seen evidence of that in, we have a program area that we're promoting called Healthier U.S. Schools, and the First Lady, Michelle Obama, announced a goal to double the number of U.S. schools in that. It's a recognition program for schools that both live up to the highest standards for nutrition, but also promote, similarly, high standards in terms of activity. And in a number of those schools, they have either grown or have had access to garden plots. And it's amazing the testimony you hear from teachers about kids going out to those garden plots and kind of thinking through and connecting and saying, hey, this is where that lettuce comes from, or this is where those tomatoes come from. And I think in our lives, and that may be a particular problem in cities as well, we get too far removed from those things, and we are too dependent at this point in American history on processed foods, and we have a problem with portion size, among other things as well. So our goal in that child nutrition program is to increase the participation of children by at least 1 million children over the next 5 years. We want to make grants to states, not-for-profit groups for web-based and other systems to streamline the application process. I met with some people earlier this morning that are deeply interested and aware of the attrition that we experience in these programs when you force parents to fill in forms and to go through all these complicated certification processes, sort of like doing your taxes, only trying to get your child access to decent and reliable, healthy food. We are proposing to Congress that we utilize a number of bonus incentive systems so that we can get states to do a better job, because the USDA itself does none of these programs, operates none of them directly. We operate through state agencies, and as was mentioned, that's what I did most of my career, worked at the state level. And so we want to give bonuses to states that improve participation, improve direct certification. We want to promote the further development of paperless systems, because we currently have, again, we have complicated, more complicated than it should be, participation requirements. We want to improve and increase that school breakfast participation. As I mentioned, we have about 11.5 million children nationally. I'm seeing the convergence in a number of areas of beliefs and practices that I think will help us considerably improve that school breakfast participation. And one of the most important elements of that is breakfast in the classroom, and with more experience yesterday, I was at an event with the Chicago Public Schools food service director and some students from Chicago. And Chicago now, in about 180 of their elementary school, does breakfast in the classroom. And in order to do that, they had to overcome the inertia and the resistance of classroom teachers, building folks, custodians, other folks who thought, oh my God, this is going to mess this place up. This is going to create problems for us. Yet, in the experience, teachers say, wow, I see a difference in the kids. I don't see them sleepy. I don't see them so wound up later in the morning. I see the efficacy of that breakfast in the classroom. And to me, that's the most powerful motivator. It's not a brochure from the USDA. It is a classroom teacher speaking to her peers or a building principal speaking to his or her peers about the benefits that they have experienced with this. And I'm very excited about that because up to this point in time, I think one of the challenges in school breakfast has been, well, particularly in places that bus students to school, how are we going to deal with the bus schedules and the logistics of that, bringing kids into a central gym or a central feeding place. So we want to really much more aggressively promote school breakfast. We also want to really improve the meal quality in the child and adult care feeding programs for child care. Each day in the country, 11 million children are cared for in child care. And we have a feeding program called the Child and Adult Care Feeding Program. We have contracted with the Institute of Medicine of the National Academy to make recommendations to us to improve the quality of that nutrition experience. These are for the majority of these kids, very young children. And again, to the extent that you can promote, encourage, and have very young children experience more nutritious meals in childcare, again, that's going to carry over to those kids when they get into school. And we also want to expand that program. It currently provides meals to at-risk kids in 14 states. We want it in all 50 states, that child and adult care feeding program. We want to improve and expand access to foods when school is out, the snack program and the supper programs we see in many areas. We have funds we proposed for summer demonstration projects, for community garden projects, for various incentives to states to really try to get states to strengthen and beef up both access and the quality of the programs that we're offering. And most importantly, and a good note for me to end on here, the President has proposed $1 billion additional per year over 10 years. And my biggest fear in this reauthorization is that it will be, I believe it will be reauthorized. I'm reasonably confident that's going to happen. But my fear is that it would be reauthorized at a discount, that it not be robustly funded. And you know, in our own experience, to buy better foods, healthier foods, you don't need, you know, a higher education degree from institutions like this one to know that healthier foods often cost more in our own experience. And the same is true of institutional feeding programs, whether it's schools or individual household families. And so I think it's important that we underscore in any exchanges you may have with members of Congress that we really need to fully fund the child nutrition reauthorization so that we have the opportunity to probe and explore and to finance and promote pilots, as well as provide additional resources for access to children across the country. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you today, and I look forward to our panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Concannon. A few things before we move to the panel. In all of our public events, we aim to have a constructive conversation and dig deeper into the issues, and I hope come up with a better grasp of solutions. Some of the issues on the table, given what we just heard, is it possible to end child hunger in the United States or in New York? What are the politics of the Child Nutrition Act reauthorization? I hope we'll dig a little bit into that. Is it desirable to have more and freer school lunch and breakfast for more kids? Seems obvious to me, but it's something to talk about. What are the systemic barriers to having higher quality food and fewer highly processed foods in schools? And in a city with more than 1,500 schools and more than 1 million school children, what are the hurdles to getting locally or regionally farmed food onto the school lunch tray? Before we go to the panel, I just want to thank Karen Mirowitz, who organized this program. She's been working on this issue since long before she joined the center. And she got a lot of advice from some of you, so thanks to all of you who helped with organizing this. I also wanted to point out that Undersecretary Concannon has to leave a little bit before we finish today. and it's only because he has to get back to D.C. early, so don't be offended if he gets up and leaves at about 10:15. I hope you all will stick around for the rest of the conversation after that. So to help us dig into this discussion, we're lucky to have Fred Mogul, a reporter for WNYC. He covers health and medicine for the largest, for the public radio station with the largest audience in the country. Fred was a print journalist before that, writing for Time Magazine and the New York Times and other papers, but he's been on the radio now for, I think, 7, 8 years at WNYC. Why don't the panelists come on up, and I'll turn it over to Fred.
Well, good morning. Thanks, everyone, for coming out. The panelists, obviously, and all of you as well, on a soggy morning here, but hopefully we'll generate a little heat with the discussion. I'm counting on the panelists in that regard quite a bit. You all know the issues better than I do, better than most of the people in this room, I imagine. Many of you have spent decades cumulatively on this, so I hope you'll give it to each other quite hard as we go forward. Just briefly recapping who's joining us to speak today. You've already heard from Kevin Concannon, the Undersecretary for Food, Nutrition, and Consumer Services. He's on his left is Jim Weil, the President of the Food Research and Action Center, or FRAC, which he's led since 1998. Before that, he was the Program Director and General Counsel at the Children's Defense Fund. We have Janet Poppendick, a professor of sociology at CUNY's Hunter College and the author of Free for All, Fixing School Food in America. There was some talk that copies of the book would be here, and they are indeed here, so by all means, check it out if you have some time afterwards. Next, we have Eric Goldstein, the CEO of School Food, the New York City Department of Education Division of Food and Transportation. He's in charge of 830,000 student meals a day. He is himself a graduate of New York City schools, including Jamaica High School. And we have Jonathan Stein as well from Philadelphia. Jonathan is the General Counsel for Community Legal Services there. And as such, he helped secure universal service feeding so that all children in a group of 200 schools would be entitled to free meals without a means test, without a written application. So we'll look forward to hearing from him about that program and what New York City and what the nation can learn about that.
Fred, I'm a graduate of James Madison High School of Brooklyn.
Ah, very good. All right.
Go Brooklyn. I grew up here, too, and went to school. Let's get this all out.
Right. Well, very good. I think, is James Madison where Senator Schumer went as well, I think? I don't know. The only thing, what I know about them is he said of the James Madison basketball team, we may be short, but we're also slow. So that might have been James Monroe, but I think it was Madison. In any event, I mean, I have lots of questions, but I would love it if you all, having just heard the Undersecretary speak, if anyone wants to jump right in and ask him about the Child Nutrition Act, about his priorities, response to anything you heard, anyone?
Well, go ahead.
Please, Jen.
I'll jump. Because I was very interested in your comment about a concern that while, of course, child nutrition reauthorization will be reauthorized, that our $1 billion that we're counting on might be worn away. I know it's a toxic environment right now in Washington around expenditure, but I think that $1 billion is not nearly enough to do what we need to do, and I'd like to know how much you think it would cost to realize the goals that Secretary Vilsack has articulated for child nutrition.
Well, I think, $1 billion is the largest increase in this program area ever. You can always make a case for even more. But my worry, again, is not so much if somehow people are persuaded there ought to be more. That's America. My worry is that people will try to discount it, say we can't come up with $1 billion, so please be maybe we'll fund it at $5 billion over 10 years instead of 10. So first and foremost, I know a lot of work when I'm very aware of all the work that went into it changes so that when the president's budget was announced here about a month ago, it indeed had the $1 billion in it. So I think now it's up to Congress to make sure that that priority is met. And, there are arcane rules about pay-go and other ways of financing programs federally. These days there is worry about, the deficit in the country. So there are a lot of politics swirling around. I think the Secretary said it best at a hearing probably 2 months ago, saying, if it's a priority, and it should be a priority, it should be funded fully.
Yeah, I'd like to just follow up on what Jan said, and really not quote the Secretary, but President Obama, because a month before he was elected in November, his platform established or sought the end of childhood hunger by 2015. And although the measures are very laudable and pretty wonderful in the administration's proposal of reauthorization, we have yet to see a plan to end childhood hunger in 2015. When Prime Minister Blair took office in Britain in 1999, he announced not the end of childhood hunger, but the end of childhood poverty in a generation, which is a goal beyond ending childhood hunger, obviously. And so I guess the question is, where is the plan to end childhood hunger by 2015? What would constitute it? Doesn't it require raising incomes of low-income families, and going beyond food programs to looking at the income and financial supports of low-income families? And where is the plan? And when will we get it if it's not there?
Well, I can tell you from the USDA's point of view, our plan is to promote more fully the existing authorities we have, because I can speak to that from my own state experience. When you go before state legislators making a case for more resources, and they turn and they see, well, you're not fully availing yourself of the authorities we've already given you, so come back and see us when you're more fully engaged that. And my approach right from the earliest weeks I've been at USDA has been to more fully engage for example, the SNAP or the food stamp program. Only about 2/3 of current eligibles in the U.S. participate in it, and even that figure is misleading because there's tremendous variability among states. For example, in California, only half of the eligibles in California participate. Is that accidental? No, it isn't. It's a reflection of the accretion of a whole series of difficult policies in places like California. And I might even say, as an aside, I'm very mindful as I come to New York City of the practice of finger imaging that is required of applicants for food assistance. That's not a federal requirement. That's something that developed locally. I think it's clearly a burden for low-income people, and it's not one, as I've said in the city before, I would approve if it came to me. So to your question, we start with that, and then we move to the second largest program, and that is the Child Nutrition Reauthorization. You build on those. You don't just write a paper that is separated from them.
I'd like to both jump in on the criticism of the administration and defend the administration. On the 2015 question Jonathan raised, I also hope that over time the administration will have a single plan, but I'd also, and there is actually a plan on FRAC's website that we wrote, which is frac.org, which involves incomes and tax credits as well as the nutrition programs, all of which we think are necessary to get there. And to give the administration credit, they don't have a single plan, but in very complicated times, they've taken some aggressive steps in the Recovery Act and elsewhere to move these things forward, not just the child nutrition, which I'll come back to in a second, but there was a big increase in food stamp benefits in the Recovery Act last year. There was a big increase in refundable tax credits, EITC, and child tax credit, which was in the Recovery Act last year, in which the President has now proposed making permanent, which would be hugely important to poverty and hunger and so on. On the child nutrition reauthorization dollars, we also had hoped it would be much more than $1 billion a year, and we'll continue to press for that. I'm not wildly optimistic about getting more than $1 billion. I do think that Secretary Vilsack and Kevin Concannon sweated blood to get the $1 billion in the President's budget, but he probably can't tell you that. But I think I saw his head move up and down. And the other thing I want to underscore is these programs are hugely elastic, as Kevin was saying. We've gone, and some of this was Congress, some of it was inflation, but a lot of it was just greater use of the programs in the states. We've gone from the nutrition program spending $30 billion a year in Clinton's last year to $60 billion a year in Bush's last year to about $90 billion this year to more than $100 billion next year. And that's because all of them except WIC are entitlements, and participation and benefits can be driven up by state action. So when we're talking about $1 billion a year added to the program, and I agree it's only $1 billion, it's only a 5% increase, we need to do better. That's $1 billion change in the rules, but there's still the opportunity to drive billions of dollars of increases within existing rules.
Eric, maybe you could talk a little bit about the city's perspective. What you would most like to hear from the federal government, aside from bigger checks and so forth. What part of reauthorization, whether it's what the Undersecretary spoke about today or what you've just been wanting for a long time, what are your top goals? What would you like to hear from them?
Well, I should just say, having dealt with several administrations, this one by far is the friendliest towards the school food program, at least from an operator's point of view. Really, what the USDA is talking about and advocating is really perfectly, almost perfectly aligned with what we think is needed and reasonable. So we're incredibly pleased about that. Of course, you know, as we all talk about, when the tide's going out, both at the federal, state, and municipal levels, that's tough because money just really, really matters. I know that's shocking to everybody. And as we have these goals, which some way are unfriendly with each other, which is improving the quality with potentially less money, it's incumbent on all of us to figure out how to do that in a smarter way. And I think some of their proposals like paperless, incentives for breakfast, et cetera, are smarter ways to do things. So we're very impressed with their agenda, actually, and it does dovetail very well with ours.
Mr. Undersecretary, given that, well, the perpetual shortage, but this, you know, the $1 billion, as much progress as it might represent, and the long-term progress that we just heard about from the 90s on forward, even so, how do you prioritize the goals that you started with, whether it's the basic expansion, the breakfast expansion, the paperless? If you had to start at the top of your list with the limited resources, what's at the tippy top?
Well, at the top of my list is, as I think I adverted to it, is, and it's current. Don't need any further authorization. It is to expand the access and utilization across the country of the SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. As I mentioned, only about 2/3 of current eligible. Some states are grossly underperforming: California, Texas, Colorado. There's a handful of states with large populations that if they did a better job, and as Jim referenced, it's not a fund problem. We can pay for that access. It is a matter of surgically getting rid of some of these policies that states have, as I've described it, accreted over the years. That's very important because, again, half of the beneficiaries in that program are children, and it goes 365 days a year. So that's important. But then it has a very important secondary effect on the child nutrition programs because To the extent that children or families participate in SNAP or the food stamp program, they're automatically deemed eligible through direct certification for the school lunch, school breakfast programs. And as one of those radio programs would say, is that the end of the story? No, it goes even further because, as you may know, many school-based programs, Title I programs, for example, programs that are targeted at schools to help them where they have large numbers of very poor children, are derived from a formula of how many free and reduced price meals are they serving in those schools. So it ripples across, and it's part of the safety net, if you will, or the provision of supports for schools that serve large numbers of poor children. So my short-term, everyday goal is, what else can we do today to get states like California, Texas, and other places to perform better in terms of access? Now, in this program, I'd say clearly one of the factors, we want to implement as soon as possible the recommendations from the Institute of Medicine on improving the quality of meals in schools. And in order to do that, you can't just wish it would happen. You have to put resources into that. So certainly that's one of the major priorities in it. But we want to increase the number of children that participate in these programs, whether it's breakfast or lunch or the summer feeding program. Again, I'm very mindful of that because of the severe drop-off in children who need support who don't get it in the summertime. So those are some of the areas, but also we want to support a variety of incentives because we found it's almost an American thing. It isn't even so much how much the incentive is, but we have a program now called Healthier U.S. Schools. There are about 650 American schools that have been recognized for that. These are schools that are top performers in terms of the quality of food, but also exercise is built into the school. And it's a cultural thing in those schools. As was mentioned earlier, I spent most of my career in health and human services at a state level. I'm very mindful of the fact that way back in the 60s, the Surgeon General declared smoking is bad for you. Let's get rid of smoking. Well, just saying stop smoking wasn't enough. It took a series of policy changes, you know, no smoking on airlines, no smoking in public buildings, tax policies, education, children haranguing their parents. It was a variety of things that reduced smoking levels. Well, similarly, when we talk about obesity, it isn't any one single thing. It's improving the quality of meals, it's improving the quality of access to meals, but it's also making more transparent what goes into various foods. And, you know, I recently read Dr. Kessler's book, the former FDA, very courageous FDA commissioner, where he talks about, you know, the changes in American food over 40 years. And I know at the hearing, I've seen testimony that's going to be given this coming Thursday. It sounded like, you know, a class in high school chemistry, but it actually described the components in a Pop-Tart, believe it or not. And I think part of it is educating the American people so it's understandable. I think our current ways in which we purchase, provide food, whether it's not just in schools, but in our households, it's the rare person. Only 2% of Americans, by the way, adhere to the dietary guidelines that we promulgate ourselves in HHS, 2%. So when people start to say, well, those poor people aren't abiding by this, say, well, it's all of us, 2% of the American public. And part of that is understanding it. Part of that, I watched the Olympics like many of you, and there were competing, not countries, competing ads for which fast food chain had the bigger burgers or the more French fries or whatever it is. Somehow in America we think bigger is better, and it isn't necessarily so in terms of just our eating habits. So the ability for schools to both educate children, get rid of competitive foods, by the way, in schools. I don't know if I skipped that in my notes, but that is one of the hallmarks that we really believe, truly believe. There's lots of evidence that kids will eat the meals in those healthier U.S. schools I've referred to. They have vending machines, but the vending machines have healthy foods in them. And kids respond to that if they're not tempted by the a la carte, the cookies or whatever else may be there. So that's going to be a major lift for us as well. But I think if we're serious about the future of the country, we really need to do something about competitive foods in schools.
I do want to
Can
talk
I just
to...
jump in and add something about
Please.
that? Because some of you may have known we've taken some steps in that direction that have been controversial and misunderstood. So it's probably a good time to talk about New York City policy, because what we've done is, in some ways, taken the lead, and in doing so, have satisfied, it seems like, absolutely nobody. So we have regulations.
Tell us all about it, but do so briefly so we can...
Right. So basically, working with the health department, we took a very serious look at the sale of competitive foods. And what we decided on as policy is that during meal times, we were going to not allow the vending machines to be on. In addition, we created strict standards that we put out to bid, both for beverage and snack, strict enough that the industry said to us, "You'll never get anyone to respond. It's going to be horrible." And we'll say, "We're just going to try to chance it." And it turned out to be okay. And a lot of industry is reformulating a lot of their product. Of course, this is not to say that we are endorsing that kids should eat these products. We are trying to, working with Lori Benson, who I see in the audience from the department, very strongly trying to work with schools to go to non-food fundraisers. But the fact is, and the resistance has come from a lot of students and a lot of schools saying, the tide's going out, as I mentioned, in terms of financing and budget. We need to raise money. And there's no better way to raise money than through the sale of food, and especially through the sale of homemade food. And the problem is, and we really struggle, when you're trying to manage caloric intake and trying to manage competitive foods, how do you strike a balance between the two? And we've tried. We're certainly very aggressive in our standards and our policy, which we had to retract a little bit because it was felt we were too aggressive. But I think what we're going through, you'll see a lot of other big cities and sort of suburbs and rural areas go through the same sort of exercise. So it is certainly a challenge.
Well, you said you're not endorsing food, but if you're selling it in vending machines, aren't you effectively?
Yeah, let me clarify that. So, for instance, when we put out our new standards, some companies reformulated their products. In the past, it used to be that you would walk into a cafeteria, certainly in a high school, and you'd see vending machines that were loaded with full-on junk food. And the kids would choose to spend their dollar as opposed to go to the line. So what we've done is we've chased those products out, we've replaced them, plus the machines are only allowed to come on after the end of meal service. Same thing with school stores, which was a sort of a back door. So vending machine, school stores, kind of one and the same if you wanted to buy that type of product. And it's been controversial doing so because the fact of the matter is that schools do rely on that money to supplement a lot of programs that aren't paid for directly out of the budget. And trying to find some sort of compromise and trying to move them off fundraising of the sale of food onto other things, it's a challenge. It's a challenge that we're currently in the midst of.
Jan, you've been following schools around the country for some time. How does New York stack up against other districts on these issues?
Well, we would give it good marks for effort. I mean, this is a serious effort to grapple with these. But I think if you look at outcomes, it's difficult to find districts to hold up as examples of the sort of outcomes we want. But
so who's the least bad, then?
Well, we'll get to that in a minute, but sticking with New York for a moment, first off, there are serious issues of enforcement. You know, you can say that the machines are off during the lunch hour, but that doesn't mean the machines are off during the lunch hour, and I'm sure you've read the same articles I've read and no more. But that's a serious issue. If we promulgate a policy, but we don't have resources available to make sure that it's being followed, it's often not followed. But beyond that, however well-intentioned the design was, as I understand it, there were 11 criteria for determining what snacks could be sold in the vending machines in school stores. You still end up with an anomaly of, while we're trying to teach kids the value of whole foods, okay, and of eating for health, we're offering a series of snacks that are so far from what most of us think of as healthy food. And I do think that they carry the school's blessing. In fact, I think now that they're on the sort of approved for student fundraising list, they have more the school's blessing. So I'm hoping New York will go back to the drawing boards on this one. I do want to say that there are places, Portland, Oregon, I think, has simply gotten rid of all the a la carte and vending machine items. I think, Tim, did you tell me that you'd gotten rid of all the a la carte in New Haven? There are places... K through 8, okay. So it is tougher in high school. The USDA itself has examples of school success stories, but I think we've got to go beyond reformulating snacks so that they come in at less than, at 198 calories a serving, because these are still not healthy foods we want to be encouraging students to eat.
Jonathan, what can you tell us about the experience in Philadelphia? We're going to talk in a bit about the access issue and the cohort of schools you've been working with. But what can you tell us, since we're at the moment talking about the content of the cafeterias, what do you know of the situation there?
Yeah, well, there have been some improvements. I'm not sure they've been all that dramatic. There are a few experiments going on in some schools with using local, regional farm foods, but our main focus has been on access, and there is a little bit divide among advocates between those who are focusing on food quality and nutritional content, which is really important, as well as access, and they're two very complementary aims. But often I think there's not enough advocacy for access, and as a legal services, legal aid lawyer, that's really my background. And I think one of the themes that I was hearing from Kevin and from Jim is really that there's an awful lot of opportunity in this crazy system to push the envelope to get a lot more access to these food programs, and it involves empowering people locally, and one of the big gaps in child reauthorization is that there's nothing about really empowering and giving low-income families a voice in all these programs, and having them be informed, and having them be an instrument of change and improving programs, and including accountability, so that if a school district says they're making vending changes, and you have an informed parent population that could monitor that and advocate for better change. But what we've been doing is largely around access, and back in 1989 we discovered a little-known amendment to the National School Lunch Act called the Paperwork Reduction Act, and we sort of went with that to say that this whole paper application process, that's really like a 18th century process of paper that the whole country and the whole school lunch breakfast system has been stuck with since its origin, is really unnecessary if you can do a survey, a socioeconomic survey of income of families, and as was done when we got this adopted with USDA blessings in 1990-91, still the only school district in the country for almost 20 years that has this. A study is done of income of families, and it's determined that in 200 of the 280 public schools in Philadelphia, children are 75% or so or more of those schools are eligible for free meals. In 200 schools for almost 2 decades, there is not one paper application taken in 200 schools. Every child is assumed eligible for a free lunch or a free breakfast. The reimbursement is based upon from the feds on what that percentage of eligibles are. And in the very first year, 91, when that was instituted, there was in the lunch program, there was a 45% increase in lunches in middle schools. In high schools, there was a 180% increase in lunch participation. In the first year for school breakfast, there was a 26% overall increase in breakfast participation. You reduce stigma because school meals like food stamps, especially here in New York City, are means tested, and means tested programs are mean and demeaning, and they are guaranteed to keep eligible people out. And so our focus has been, and we've urged other people to focus on the application processes, the means testing processes. And a little footnote for New York City, when New York City in recent years with Los Angeles became more aware of the success of the Philadelphia program, and when they began lobbying USDA, this is in the lame duck years of the Bush administration, to adopt the Universal Service Program, which was a pilot in Philadelphia, and they asked USDA to extend that universal service no paper application program to New York and LA, and when the chairman of the Senate Agriculture Committee, Tom Harkin, joined in that, the response in the summer of 2008 of the Bush administration was to order the termination of the Philadelphia program, which tells you a lot about the politics in this area. And it was only after Secretary Vilsack's initial decision, which was to continue with that termination, and to his credit, he revisited that, reconsidered that, and reversed himself in a good way. We still have a universal service program and a commitment from the Secretary and from people in Congress who got woken up to this universal service program due to this controversy, that this should be an integral part of the reauthorization of the Child Nutrition Act, and that's why, to his credit, Kevin here and the Secretary and Administration are proposing paperless applications, or at least standards where the entire country can use paperless applications and survey techniques instead of this 18th century demeaning paper application process that really keeps kids out of a program they should be getting. A long response, sorry.
Yeah, so Kevin, we heard that history. What do you think about that 20-year experience? Is that something that could or should be applicable to the country at large, a socioeconomic survey rather than an individual application, whether it's online or paper?
No, yeah, I mean, we are serious about that. As a number of the folks have referenced this, it's a difficult process right now. It actually has the paradoxical effect of impugning the program, because you have people citing numbers saying, you know, we have a $1.8 billion improper payment or erroneous payment issue here, and part of that is counting, part of that is associated with the processing of applications. So it creates risk for us. It doesn't resolve issues. We have contracted with the Institute of Medicine and they have, I think, subbed some of that work to look at a variety of ways to refine information so we can expand the application of paperless systems. But short term, even before we get to that, I come back to my theme of the SNAP or the food stamp program. We're offering states across the country the opportunity to engage in something called categorical eligibility, which allows states to really increase the income and increase the asset limit for families to be eligible for the food stamp or the SNAP program. Why is that important? It's really important in this economy. We have a lot of people who are underemployed. I have been in offices in states I've visited from one end of the country to the other. I was up in Delaware in an office recently within the last 10 days, where the staff people in those offices tell me they are seeing people now coming into state or county offices who never envisioned in their lifetime that they would be applying for these benefits because of this extended downturn in the economy. And to the extent that we can give those opportunities, and these are congressionally supported categorical eligibility opportunities, states can increase the income eligibility for SNAP, and that extends over into then the school lunch or the child nutrition programs, so that children can be automatically certified. So there are ways, even short term, even before Congress acts on the reauthorization of the act. That's why earlier when I was talking about think of these programs as a suite, that may be somewhat of an overstatement, but think of these programs as interacting with each other constructively. It's a way to really provide support to families at a difficult time.
Fred, can I just say, one factor about this we haven't talked about is really the problems of a federalist system we have where an awful lot of discretion and, quote, options are given to states and localities. Kevin is right. There are some wonderful, in this menu of incentives and things for states and localities, there are some great things there, but it's up to localities and states to run with it. Right. And that is a good thing, but it's also a terrible thing because it allows great parts of the country not to have the kinds of eligibility criteria, like in food stamps. States could waive an assets requirement or test or make it more liberal. In Pennsylvania, we have done that. But there's no requirement to get rid of an assets test or to have a more liberalized assets test. In a breakfast program, we can do all the incentives and put more money in there and do breakfast in the classroom, all terrific things, but there's no requirement, even in all these proposals for reauthorization, to require that every school district in the country has a breakfast program. And right now, across my state of Pennsylvania, there are many school districts that have no breakfast program. Yet they have lots of poor kids who will never get a free breakfast because a superintendent and a school board have decided this is not our thing. Let parents feed their own kids, and they have about 20 other reasons why they won't have a breakfast program. And yet, in our federalist system, with all the compromises made in this legislation and even in the best proposals on the table now, there's no requirement that every school district have a breakfast program. And you can go down the list in food stamp requirements and school meals where so much is left to state and local option, and therefore so many hungry kids and hungry families never get the food they need.
Jim, Jan, for a national perspective, what do you think about mandating some of these requirements rather than, as Jonathan puts it, federalizing in the federalist sense, but not in the obligatory and uniform sense?
Well, Jonathan and I come out of the same school of legal services mandating everything one can mandate for low-income people. So I agree. I'd add on these programs that take the asset test for just as an example. We tried to get Congress to raise it or eliminate it when food stamps was up for reauthorization a couple of years ago. It's very expensive to get Congress to do that. When we talk about adding $1 billion to the budget in these times, if we can get 30 or 40 states to do it, then it's a lot cheaper to get Congress to mandate it for the last 10 states. So in some ways, it's a very synergistic process. I mean, ideally, we'd have these, these programs would look like Social Security with federal criteria and federal benefits. But there is the opportunity to work the synergies between state and local choices and federal choices to move the whole system forward. Unfortunately, it takes more time and energy than it should to do that. But, I think we're making progress, which isn't to disagree with the bottom line that as much as possible, the federal rules should drive out some of the insanity at the local and state system.
If it's a right, it should be a right for all our children. But I do want to say that here in New York, we have an exceptional opportunity, if I'm understanding Kevin correctly, that we could raise the eligibility threshold for SNAP to 200% of poverty and then use direct certification so that all the children who would then become eligible, if we would only get rid of finger imaging, because we know that finger imaging is a deterrent to participation in SNAP, and it's a deterrent that's very specific to New York. I mean, only a few places in the country have it. So, and that's a decision that could be made locally. That's a decision that could be made by our mayor. So maybe if you can explain to our mayor how getting rid of finger imaging would benefit access to school food, which is, I think, quite a brilliant analysis that Kevin has given us today, we could move that forward. While I have the floor, I have to talk for a minute about the whole issue of stigma in these programs. One of the advantages to mandating school breakfast nationwide is that it would take it out of certain sort of culture wars debates that have the effect of stigmatizing children who participate in the program, parents who send their kids to school to eat breakfast. But we have a stigma issue around school food that is very fundamental. And when you give those figures on rising participation in SNAP, part of what has happened to SNAP is that it's become somewhat destigmatized. I'm sure you've all seen the articles in the paper. This is a great leap forward. When we come to define participation in SNAP as responsible parenting and as thrift, instead of defining it as, going on the dole, we make it possible for people who care about their own self-esteem to participate. In school food, the stigma that started out as attaching to, you know, people who applied for free or free and reduced price, very quickly came to infect the meal itself and the entire program. So that when I had my students at Hunter write their school food memories for me, they used terms like county food, welfare food, free. Then once the food gets this label, then kids, you know, there is no group of people in our society struggling more to preserve their self-esteem than 13-year-olds, you know? So to create a system where you can identify yourself as one of the poor, even if it's a majority of the people in our system, by eating that particular meal, kids aren't going to do it. We need to be moving toward universal free meals, free school meals for all our children. And I have to tell you that this is the key to the quality issue as well as the key to the access issue. Because when we stop selling food to kids who are exposed to however many hours of food advertising every year, to 12 to $15 billion worth of food advertising every year. When we quit having to sell food, then we can offer them the meals that reflect what we want them to learn about food. I'm not talking about gruel, okay? I think that some of the people who care most about food quality have come up with wonderful ideas that incorporate our regional and local agriculture, but universal is the key. It's the key not just to the access, but also to meeting the needs of our region's farmers, our regional economy, and the health profile of the meals we serve, and empowering people like Jorge to get out there and fix the meals that he wants to serve kids instead of having to.
I hope you came with some questions, Jorge.
If I could just add quickly. I largely agree with Jan, but I think there's, on the stigma point, I think there's a danger that school meals are now being stigmatized more by progressives than conservatives. She was talking about conservative stigma around poverty issues. But if you look at the blogs, if you look at what's being said out there about school meals now are essentially being trashed by progressives for being terrible. And that's also hurting the program in some ways. That's not to say they're good or good enough and that we don't need to increase the quality, but the things that progressives are saying about school meals are undercutting and stigmatizing the program in many ways and are making it harder to improve and expand the program.
Eric, I see you nodding your head. I gather you about 160 or so schools have the in-class breakfasts?
Yeah, about 160. I mean, listening to all this, you know, filtering it through an operational lens of how do you actually do it. On one hand, you know, mandates would be very helpful, certainly make my job and all the folks, a lot of folks that work on school food, our jobs easier. On the other hand, I don't know if it would make the life of a principal easier. There's a lot to be said for local decisions. So while I'm torn on this, so we have to go out, we had to learn how to sell. So we have somebody who just goes out and tries to convince principals that breakfast in the classroom is a good idea. And frankly, this has made us better at it. It's made us operate better. It's made us adapt to local conditions. So that's positive. But on the other hand, it's made it slower. We're at about 160. We found, not surprisingly, that nobody except a few brave souls, PS 68 in the Bronx, for instance, jumps to mind, like to be first. And, you know, coming out of the box, we had to learn to do this. And it forced us to learn how to do it and be responsive to principals and schools, which I think is a good thing. And,
but this is not a Department of Education that's shy about telling school principals what to do, generally.
Well, I have to say, you know, Joel's philosophy really is to, you know, have the principal as the head of his school and to have the organization really cater to the principal with the main goal of trying to educate our children. And we at School Food have struggled and will continue to struggle, and I think that's a healthy thing, to figure out how we do this best. And that forces us to re-examine ourselves, to challenge ourselves, to meet the needs of our principals in our schools, which is a dynamic, not a static process.
Could I just add something to this principal autonomy issue? Because in Philadelphia we have the same, and every school district has this issue of local autonomy and the like, and the politics that go on in schools with a. But we said essentially that school meals participation is as important as all the other criteria by which principals and schools are judged: absenteeism, lateness, reading scores, math scores, and the whole bit. And there's been in Philadelphia for a number of years a principals report card which establishes the criteria, quantitative criteria for evaluating principals. And we convinced the school board, essentially, and the new superintendent that meals participation was as important and shouldn't be left to autonomy and shouldn't allow certain schools with 95% participation and others with 30% participation who are a mile apart with the same number of poor kids, and that was an outrage. And this is the first year now that on that principal's report card, there's a provision for determining what the percentage of participation in school meals, breakfast and lunch, are for every principal in the school system in Philadelphia. That's doable. It takes some leadership. Your Joel needs to get religion maybe on that score, but if a school district is serious about feeding kids, they're going to use all the accountability mechanisms they have, which they put into test scores for everything else under the sun, to do that in this area as well. And I think every district in the country can do that.
Do we know, since you have the pilot project, how many, in a place where it's universal and everyone has access to them, how many people are actually taking advantage of it? Because it seems to me that people can still bring their own lunch, or they can still kind of ignore what's on the plate. Do we have any sense of that?
Yeah, I mean, just to clarify, we have breakfast for everybody. And when we made breakfast maybe about 5 years ago universal, so that no charge to any student who comes up, whatever their classification free reduced paid is, we got rates roughly from about 11% participation to 20% participation. And that was great until we saw the FRAC league table, and we saw ourselves at the bottom. We were not that happy with that. We said, no, I thought it was very helpful for us, frankly. And we called around to all the other districts and said, well, how do you get rates like Newark has in the 90s or whatever? And the answer was very clear, breakfast in the classroom. So they said, well, we have to figure out how to do that. And we're in the process of that. And once we see breakfast in the classroom, I can tell you it is phenomenally successful. It works, there's no doubt. I mean, you get breakfast participation rates up to the 90%. We see a lot of benefits, fewer trips. We hear from principals anecdotally, fewer trips to the nurse because the kids are hungry, fewer kids are late. We think the benefits are enormous, but we have to convince principals that the benefits are enormous, and you have real life issues. New York City has 1,600 schools built 150 years ago to just come online. The schools are, the facilities are different, they have different challenges. We had to bring different unions to support us, the teachers union, which has been very supportive, which is just critical. Also the custodians, and really get everyone in line by showing them that this doesn't make their life more difficult. In fact, this one of the benefits is it could make their life easier. So now we're about 22%. So we've seen from breakfast in the classroom, about 1 million extra breakfasts this year just for breakfast in the classroom. It's really been phenomenal. One element we're dealing with, we're hearing some criticism that says, well, maybe it's not a good idea. Maybe from a caloric point of view, kids are eating 2 breakfasts and breakfast in the classroom is not good. That debate, from what I understand, is perhaps unique to New York. We'll need to address it. We don't agree with that point of view, but we have to now examine that. So roughly we have 22% of our kids eating breakfast with us right now, and roughly about 67% of our kids eating lunch with us. We think that if you eat breakfast with us, is probably a higher correlation that you'll eat lunch with us. But obviously, and I don't think it's atypical for New York City, higher participation rates all around for elementary school, and it drops off once you get to high school because it becomes, as we all know, a lot less about food and a lot about other things as well.
What about in Philadelphia, Jonathan? Do you know how many are taking advantage of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the breakfast participation is somewhat higher. It probably is in the mid-30s to 40%. I mean, there is actually the school district adopted really the FRAC goal of setting a standard of that 70% of all children getting a free or reduced price lunch should also be getting a breakfast. And they have set that as a numerical goal, and they are really showing some serious progress in getting there. And it's not only, I mean, it's a multifaceted thing. It's not only, principal accountability. It's some of the things that Eric has talked about. You really have to educate teachers that kids are going to, pay more attention. There are going to be fewer behavioral problems in classrooms if kids are fed, less going to the nurse, cognitive development, the whole range of real observable phenomena need to be communicated, as well as dealing with some of the myths about, there'll be garbage or there'll be more disruption, whatever. But there's been a significant increase in breakfast participation that's on the rise in Philadelphia. And in fact, the school district on its own 2 years ago, I talked about the 200 universal schools out of 280 that were established back in '91. 2 years ago, the school district said that in all the schools, close to 300 schools, breakfast will be universal. So in every school, there's a free breakfast available for every child. And of course, it diminishes in participation as you get into the higher grade schools.
I just want to point out that as we heard, the Undersecretary is going to have to leave soon. So we're going to start taking questions shortly. So people, and I hope there are many of you, if you could start gravitating towards the microphones. Microphone, single? The microphones will gravitate to you, so just start raising your hands. Karen and Anna will come to you, and we'll start taking questions momentarily. While that's going on, Mr. Undersecretary, I wonder if you could just talk to the budgetary challenges. We've heard about a bit, but we have New York and Philadelphia. We're hearing about this experience of universalizing breakfast. You set it as a goal. How much of the budget could get eaten up just by doing that alone? I wonder. Well,
we are in a very difficult time for any public or not-for-profit programs in terms of budget, and as I think most people in the room are aware, these are counter-cyclical at the very time when your resources your revenues may be going down, the need is rising, and we're certainly seeing that in our entitlement programs. But fortunately, as Jim mentioned, they are categorized federally as entitlement, so we don't have to suppress that need or build barriers. If anything, as I say, we're in the middle of we continue to try to urge, cajole, embarrass in a few cases some states to try to do a better job with providing access to people. Now,
but then you overlay a new mandate. I mean, that's just getting to what's out there for basic eligibility. Right. Now, if you talk about overlaying a new mandate, how do you get there?
Well, that's where, again, in the Child Nutrition Reauthorization, that's where, to me, $1 billion, and as Jim said, we'd like to see it more, and I've heard that from many very informed advocates as well. But it was an important lift to have the president fulfill his commitment. I mean, he wanted to, but there are lots of people between the president and the budgeteers, as I think anybody who knows government policy, you have to go through lots of layers of persuading, urging, demonstrating, proving the need. And the fact that the billion and 10 billion over 10 years survived, I think, is very significant. And we can't do everything even with that billion, but I think we have enough of a range of initiatives that we can support that we can actually make significant progress on the child nutrition program. So you can't turn everything into a mandate because the cost implications of that are huge at a time when, again, probably more challenges in the federal budget than we've seen in some years. But the billion will help us go a long way. There's no question about that.
I want to take a first question and just first of all, make sure the microphone's on. Say who you are very briefly, and a question should be a question, not a statement for the most part. So keep it short and sweet, please.
Sure. Daniel Bowman Simon. I'm very happy, Mr. Undersecretary, that you mentioned school gardening in CNR. And it's not just the anecdotal evidence, but actual peer-reviewed studies that show that kids who garden are more willing to eat vegetables and express that preference. They'll actually go home and nag their parents to put more vegetables on the table. And it's not historically unprecedented either. In 1931, here in New York City, 302 schools out of 700 elementary schools had 65 acres of school gardens under cultivation. So I'm wondering, can you talk more about specific mandatory authorizations the administration is pushing for school gardens in CNR. Thanks.
Yes, I think actually the administration has proposed a budget target to enhance the number of schools that have school gardens, but as of this point, it isn't in the category of mandatory. Again, we have lots of information coming into us from schools that have availed themselves or created gardens and the benefits for their students, but it's not a mandate per se. But we are encouraging and putting money in to promote additional school gardens across the country. And I would put that in the category also somewhat related to the fact of the initiative that our department has promoted, particularly the Deputy Secretary, Kathleen Merrigan, of Know Your Farmer, Know Your Food, or Farm to School. We're trying to really promote more of the synergies with either regional farmers. Again, I mentioned it in passing earlier, instead of trucking stuff across the country, of trying to both, again, create the opportunity for growing and sourcing local foods regionally as a benefit, not only in terms of the quality of food and an educational process for students, but also helping those regional economies.
We have a question over there.
Hi, my name is Kristen Mancinelli. I work for City Harvest, and I'm coordinating a group in New York City called New York City Alliance for Child Nutrition Reauthorization. Many folks in this room are members of that coalition, and we are speaking directly with our members of Congress on this issue. One question that I have is there seems to be a broad misunderstanding around what $1 billion would actually go for in the reauthorization. And so I've actually seen articles in the New York Times saying that $1 billion would roughly equal a 20-cent increase per meal in the reimbursement rate. My understanding is that actually the funding would go to many other things, including expanding access and so forth. I wondered if you could address that.
Right, I think that's correct. I'm not familiar with that article you referenced, but the billion really is, we have not parsed it out in our exchanges with members of Congress or their staff to say this is expressly how we want you to pencil through that $1 billion. And there's no question, to the extent that more of it goes on individual meal reimbursement, the less there is for some of the other access issues or some of the other initiatives that I've referenced. So we have said, look, here's $1 billion. These are some of the priorities we have in it, but we are willing and want to work with your staff. We haven't tried to cement it into specific categories.
Hi, my name is Nancy Romer. I'm from the Brooklyn Food Coalition and also working with the New York City Alliance for Child Nutrition Reauthorization. We've got letters to sign to our senators. Please don't leave without signing. My question to you is, how do you see grassroots activism, as Daniel suggested, around gardens, around cooking for kids, around salad bars, even within the formula that we have now, which is very thin, but would be significantly enriched? We had a big boost in the expenditure and local source. How do you see the role of grassroots activism of parents to really push this agenda forward?
Who wants to take a stab at that?
I'm not sure I totally understood the question, because when you start talking about grassroots activism and reauthorization, my ears immediately perk up and I'm ready to launch into a 5-minute description of what you ought to do in terms of contacting your members for the agenda that presumably we'll all agree on, starting with pushing your members to put as much new money into reauthorization as possible. And so that's particularly members of Ways and Means Committee and leadership and the money people, as opposed to the people who actually write the bills. And so grassroots activism from parents, from everybody here is incredibly important for that. And then around the particular agenda items of expanding access and improving meals. On some of the particular things you talked about, farm to school, school gardening, There are probably people better able to talk to that than me.
Well, but let me just take a stab, because
Can you move up the microphone, please?
The greater the money, the better the meals, the better the access, the more participation, the more schools will have resources if they're motivated to experiment with gardening. You know, I think that the primary agenda and the primary focus of grassroots activism needs to be getting at least that whole billion, and I want to say I'm with the New York City Alliance for Child Nutrition Reauthorization. We asked for $4 billion a year. We
all understand that everyone wants more, so let's sort of
work
within the constraints that
yes, but there's a grassroots activism issue here, which is that you don't concede the ground before the fight is over. And if people out here make noise about what we see as the real needs, that'll make it easier for our members of Congress to fund that, you know, the full billion that the president put into the budget and that Kevin and his colleagues sweated for. So don't concede the territory before the struggle has begun. But I do think that the grassroots activism needs to focus on getting the best access and the best meals we can, and then schools will have more reimbursements coming in and more ability to direct them toward gardening. In terms of farm to cafeteria and local sourcing, we made huge steps in the last several reauthorizations to removing barriers to that. Now there needs to be some mandated funding, and I don't mean mandated in the sense of the federal government telling schools you have to do this, but mandatory funding in that it's not enough to just authorize it in the law. It's got to have funding attached to it to enable schools to confront the logistical challenges that make this difficult for schools to do.
All right, I wanted to ask... go ahead.
One point I want to add to that, I mean, certainly contacting members of the delegation, but also engaging, you know, like the coalition referenced here, whether it's a building principal or a pediatrician or what have you. You know, one of the themes that we keep trying to express, excuse me, in the reauthorization is, while we're asking you for more funds short term, there is no question or doubt in our minds that to the extent that we target these funds for more nutritious foods, for helping to solve issues of obesity and hunger, hunger, long term, it will save funds. And we're mindful of even a report recently done by, I forget the exact number, I think there were 75 retired generals and admirals who, under the theme of Mission Possible, have said now 3/4 of the age cohort in the U.S. of people between the ages of 17 and 24 are ineligible for military service because of 3 factors, excuse me, obesity, criminal records, or dropping out of high school. And so they have been they've been urging Congress to adequately fund this from a long-term security point of view in the country. So it's not just the most liberal part of American polity that should be supporting this. And, you know, during the year in which we've had continuing debate, if we can call it that, around healthcare issues, one byproduct of that certainly has been the recognition that chronic conditions disproportionately affect healthcare expenditures. And to the extent that we make investments that result in healthier children, this is one of the best investments we can make. And if you're not morally urged to do that, you can just call your CPA and they'll advise you that you're going to save money if we have better outcomes in terms of children.
Eric, I just wanted to ask you if are there any regulatory, since we're focusing a lot on the budgetary aspect, but are there any regulatory burdens that you would like to see removed that would make it easier operationally for you to acquire food in a different way? I gather that sometimes there's issues with being forced to take the low bidder or being kind of hemmed in a bit that way.
Yeah, no, that certainly is a concern for us, because when we do any sort of government procurement, you know, price matters. Certainly when you do a bid process as opposed to a proposal process, not to get into the weeds of how procurement contracts are let, but price certainly does matter. And local goods historically have not been cheaper just because of the larger dynamics of the food industry. And that's something that I know has been on the minds of a lot of people in local government, state government, federal government, advocates, ourselves. But, you know, we do buy here in New York City, just to frame it a little bit, a lot locally. Milk, we buy about 7 million gallons of milk, all from New York farmers. And apples, we buy almost like $3 million worth of apples in various forms from New York farmers. So two of the main crops from our state, you know, which is essentially dairy and apples, we do buy a lot. And certainly to see other incentives that would allow us to go local and not have to bend to some sort of the lowest bidder regulations would certainly be a big help.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, there's a question over there.
Yes, my name is Ellen Emerson. I'm a recently retired Navy commander, now volunteering with Wellness in the Schools here in New York City. My question is for the Undersecretary. I wanted to raise the issue that you brought up about the 75% of our youth not being eligible for military service. My question for you, sir, is are there any partnership programs between the Department of Agriculture and the DoD? You talked earlier about synergy, and so are we looking for any cross-departmental synergy to address the issue?
That's an excellent question, but actually we do. Currently, we are linked with DoD around access to fresh fruits and vegetables, and as part of the stimulus bill, there were additional funds awarded through that DoD contract to improve access to fresh fruits and vegetables. So we do work with them. We use their distribution system across the country, and we're very much engaged with that group of retired, senior officers as a way of, again, conveying that this has broad implications for the whole country long term as well.
Can I just add to that one statistic which is really jarring? So in New York City, roughly about 73% of our students are either free or reduced. Out of our million-plus students, about 40% are either overweight or obese. That's, about 400,000 kids. That's a small city, essentially, perhaps not such a small city. This is a real serious problem, and I'm glad to hear that the military is thinking about it because they were there when the bill was created initially, and I think it's an important voice in America to be part of this debate. So it's welcome news, really.
If they'll just redirect to us 2% of their budget, we'll be able to.
I'm okay with that.
One of the city schools I noticed was experimenting with a meat-free day once a week. Is anyone discussing that on any large scale at all? Either at I know that's one, and there's discussion about expanding it within the district. But what about so you could address that very briefly, district-wide, but also nationwide.
Yeah, we have that on Friday. We have Pizza Fridays, which is meat-free. I mean, everyone has, which culture and food. They're married. So when you say meat-free, people have a certain idea of what that means. So sometimes you say pizza. Well, that's not meat-free. Well, it is really. But look, bringing plant-based menu, center of the plate menu entrees for us has been a big push. I know Chef Jorge and his team have been working diligently on that. Having something like tofu as a reimbursable protein would be a big help. But these are things that certainly would be helpful. So that is very topical.
And on a national scale, maybe both Kevin and Jim can address the politics of it, the feasibility of it, the economics of it.
Well, I think it's certainly feasible. And again, I've heard, in meetings we've been part of where there's a desire to make sure that schools have that option, to have meat-free days and so on. So, again,
what about incentivizing it positively rather than just allowing it to be possible is one thing?
I don't think that's politically in the cards.
Yeah. You've talked to the Cattlemen's Beef Association lately.
There's a question over here.
Hi. My name's Bob Klein. I'm with the Coalition for Safe and Healthy Foods in New York City Schools. And I'm just wondering if don't you agree that before the school food is encouraged or pushed on in a larger number of children and their parents, shouldn't it be as healthy as possible? I know, for instance, that the chocolate milk has high fructose corn syrup in it and quite possibly made with genetically modified recombinant.
I'd like to answer that. If we wait to make the meals as healthy as possible before we have kids in the program, we'll close the programs down. there are two beliefs. There are two things everybody in this country believes about Kevin's programs. One is that people are buying crap with food stamps, and two, that the schools are feeding kids crap at school breakfast and school lunch. As I understand the research, people are buying with food stamps exactly what the rest of us buy, and sometimes doing a little bit better, even though the resources in their communities to actually get healthy food are worse. And two, school meals, while certainly not good enough, and we certainly have to make them better, are better than what kids are eating at home, or better than what kids bring from home to school, or better than what kids get when they leave campus. We've been undertaking, policy unfortunately moves slowly in this country. We've been undertaking really since early in the Clinton administration, we, meaning the nation, not FRAC, a long-term effort to improve school food in this country. Standards have improved, the number of schools complying with standards have gotten better. The IOM process is going to make the standards even better. But the assumption that school meals are currently harming children, and therefore we don't have to address access problems, and until school meals are made considerably healthy, we should just let kids fend for themselves, is an extremely dangerous notion.
Well, but what about rather than the global goal of it, if you'll excuse the mixed metaphor, the low-lying fruit of chocolate milk? Why have chocolate milk? I mean, if kids won't drink milk, then they won't drink milk, but at least it won't be negative.
Well, I believe in making whatever improvements we can as rapidly as we can and going for the low-lying fruit. In a incredibly complex, privatized system in a capitalist country, there just ain't that much low-lying fruit. Like the meat question, like the chocolate milk question, like all these questions, there are, major interest groups that make it harder to either mandate things or incentivize things or get things done at the local level. Saxby Chambliss, who's going back to the competitive foods discussion earlier, Saxby Chambliss is the ranking minority member on the Senate Agriculture Committee. He's actually been, he's very conservative. He's been surprisingly supportive of the nutrition programs by and large, but things that would greatly damage Coca-Cola are hard to move through the Senate Agriculture Committee. I feel like I've spent too much time this morning apologizing for the system, and maybe I need to go off in the desert for a couple of years and rethink this. That's where we are.
Over there.
I'll look for Jan to give me some. What did medieval sinners get from the church?
Indulgence. You need indulgences. Well, but indulgences are kind of a good framework to talk about chocolate milk for a moment because. Right.
Very, very briefly, because we have a question.
Okay. I was just saying that there is far from unanimity at the idea that chocolate milk is worse than no milk at all. There are many people who care about children who observe that children drink chocolate milk more readily than they drink unflavored milk and want to preserve the chocolate milk. So it's not as if the consensus is in on chocolate milk. Now, if you want to talk to me about strawberry and vanilla milk, I'm on your side. But
my name is Herman Mazard. I'm a professor at the Engineering School of NYU, and I'm also a tech entrepreneur. I'm working on the concept of a digital grocery list. When we're talking about school food, it only accounts for about 12 to 20% of the calories that are consumed by a student during the course of the day, during the course of the month. If we're going to combat childhood obesity, we really do have to look at the other 80% of the calories and the decisions involved in the foods that are purchased. Can you talk about school programs that educate students about making better choices in the supermarket when mommy is driving by a McDonald's, that kind of thing? Are there programs that exist?
Well, it isn't. I'm not going to answer that directly insofar as you're referencing schools alone. Although I will say this much: those healthier U.S. schools that I've referenced, again, 600 plus across the country, they incorporate education about nutrition and foods in all of the programs. So I was up in Somerville, Mass. Here about a month ago, and in the math programs, they include discussions of food and healthy food. In the gym program, in the sculpture program, in the arts, and so on. So it infuses through the school. It's not something limited to 12 to 12:30 at noon. So there are schools, leadership schools, that are doing that. But more broadly, I wanted to answer that there is a group currently meeting that involves the parts of the USDA, parts of the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, White House, folks from the White House, with a goal toward really improving the way the American public can understand foods. Within the last year or so, there was an industry effort to, I think the moniker they used for it was right choice. And it was supposed to be able to convey to you as a purchaser, when you looked at the front of the box, this is a good, healthy choice for you. I'm mindful that Fruit Loops was one of the items that got a right choice. And what it reflects is that, a lot of foods get infused with all kinds of other additives that sort of tip them over into this category of right food. So back to your question, there is a group that is working on federal agencies across federal lines, not that common, by the way, historically, to come up with a plan later this year that can better educate and be more transparent and understandable for all Americans, not just people in schools, but American purchasers, so that when you buy something in the store, you'll have a better, more immediate understanding. That back of label, the nutrient stuff, now, yes, it may say sugar, but then it may say corn syrup, it may say something else. They all add up to something that adds, sweeteners. So we are working on that as a federal government to try to convey that to the whole population.
If I could follow up, when I was growing up, I'm 44 years old, so I went to public school many years ago, and we had a home economics program and that's where a lot of the teaching about choices and things, so that if the parents don't know, the children do know. I think the gentleman over there said that sometimes children can be a better influencer than television or the mass media. And can you talk about, say, the home economics programs, where that's been, and is something like that being considered for the school program?
Does anyone know?
Well, Kevin's leaving, so.
And I like Fruit Loops. They're magically delicious.
What? I don't know any data on home economics programs, although my sense, like yours, is they've largely disappeared. That may be more a function of school reform and the way it's driven a lot of stuff out of curriculum as much as anything else. There are some USDA and other federal programs of nutrition education. There's something called Team Nutrition and things like that. There obviously needs to be a lot more of that. We've been talking today about schools, this stuff, and not childcare, not after school, not summer. This stuff ought to be done also in after school and summer feeding programs and early in childcare. Most of what kids are taught in childcare, they learn numbers through foods. You have a book with 5 apples in it. There's incredible potential that we don't have time to get into in childcare to improve food and to do nutrition education. And the last thing I'd say about people outside of the school context is we, like others, have worked for the last few years on doing things like trying to improve corner stores and things like that. And I've personally come to the conclusion that that's not going to cut it, that we've got to get full-service grocery stores everywhere in this country. The new Obama food financing initiative is a good step forward, and we're not going to solve this problem through corner stores and green carts and things like that, although I'm all in favor of those.
We just have a few minutes left to try to get in as many questions as we can.
I was just going to add one
please.
thing to that. It's not so much adding home ec as much as something as basic as promoting and urging schools to reintroduce recess and activity time so that kids can exercise. And, you know, the recent study that showed in a school system where they, at noontime, they started recess before they had kids come back in to eat, actually resulted in kids eating more of the meal and instead of rushing, only eating part of the plate and rushing out into the yard. So there are even some basic things along that line. And in our Healthier U.S. School challenges, we urge schools to really create incentives so that kids actually, you know, exercise more, because that's, you know, there's lots of evidence now about how many hours children spend either in front of a television or in front of a computer, and that they don't get sufficient physical exercise, period. So I'm going to have to excuse myself. It's been a great morning here. I wanted to say to Jim's point about schools, we're very appreciative of the fact that New York, to its credit, when Costco came along and said, we want to open a couple of stores in New York, we use that as an occasion to how shall I say, encourage Costco to accept food stamps. And they did so as part of their negotiations to come into the city. And lo and behold, after only about 3 weeks of processing food stamp benefits, our New York office got a call from the Costco leadership to say, we want all 400 Costcos in the country, and that's happened. So, to Jim's point.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Undersecretary. Have a safe trip back to Washington. And we do have a few minutes more, not too many, but as I said, we'll try to get as many questions as we can.
Hi.
We have one over here, please.
Good morning. Hi. My name is Megan Charlotte. I work with the Montefiore School Health Program. We have 18 school-based health centers, and I was actually part of the Bronx Coalition that pushed the milk policy. And this isn't my question, but I just want to say that in the Bronx schools, where we only serve chocolate milk on Friday afternoons, actually consumption of milk is as good as it was pre the elimination of whole and sweetened milk. So actually, no worries. And I want to also say, because of that experience, stick to your AA-12 guns. But my question is this. If you know much about schools, especially elementary schools, you know that the people who are in the cafeterias with the children are school aides. And you know that the ratio of school aides to children is kind of usually around 60 to 1, 60 children to 1 adult, or sometimes 70 or more to 1 adult. And if you've ever heard the volume of sound in a cafeteria, and if you've ever actually tried to see recess, where the ratio is this. And my question to you is, and I guess also in Pennsylvania, where do your adult to child ratios lie for recess and cafeteria time? And where in school, in thinking about food, are we thinking about how many adults it takes to sit at a table and to have a calm meal and to have adults outside so that children are actually playing with enough supervision so they're not pushing each other and pulling each other and getting hurt and then going to the nurse's office and she's saying, why don't you just have them sit in the auditorium? And that reality, I'm not hearing conversation about adults. I just say that when I see cook shop, in answer to that engineer, cook shop in the classroom and the teachers are working, the kids sit, they have to learn how to talk to each other. They don't actually have the meal experience at home. But when they have an adult, they learn it. I'm sorry to talk, okay.
Any thoughts on that from the operational perspective of more adults in the cafeterias? I imagine you'd probably like that, but...
Sounds great. We are talking about kids, though. They are noisy and do like to run around, so that's important too. So sounds like a good idea in general.
But the problem with money is, the principals say we're cutting our school aides, we don't have enough adults. But thinking about this money and thinking about...
I just said, I mean, I think schools have been strapped, increasingly strapped for resources across the board, but both food and physical activity and recess have been at the bottom of the priority list now for a generation. and we're seeing the after effects of that.
Well, we're just about winding down, but I think we're going to take one last question, please.
Hi, my name is Miriam. I'm a school gardener, and I'm asking from a position of ignorance. It is the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and we haven't spoken so far about USDA policies that might be in conflict with some of the priorities that Undersecretary Concannon mentioned. And this, this is, I'm just throwing that out there. Are there policies that that run counter to these priorities, like subsidized agricultural subsidies?
You mean like subsidizing corn and soy and what have you, so they become such cheap ingredients that we develop an entire manufacturing infrastructure? Yes.
No, that's fine. Can you just, if you want to answer, by all means, just step to the microphone or push the microphone out. Jan? I just wanted to hear your answer, but...
Oh, no, I was asking if she was referring to the fundamental subsidies for corn and soy and other basic commodities that have made them relatively cheap in a way that's induced the creation of an enormous industry based on using these ingredients in manufacturing. These are the ingredients that prolong the shelf life of packaged goods. So in many ways, our fundamental agricultural subsidy structure can be seen as contributing to the increasing reliance on those foods with the long list of ingredients on the label that the Undersecretary mentioned. So yeah, I mean, we definitely need to look at the impact of overall agriculture policy, and we need, look, school food now is 7 billion meals a year. If we can shift the procurement toward healthier foods, toward regionally produced, toward whole foods, we can start shifting the food system. So it's an entering wedge.
And I think, I got a dispensation for one final question.
Thank you.
Very short, please.
My name is Susanna Lascaris. I've been 20 years involved in community gardening and running education programs at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, so I'm very interested in actually commenting on having a sort of a general question about the internal conversation between school food, Mr. Goldstein, and along with Klein. There seem to be two dichotomies. One is there's this push to improve school foods in a really major way now, but pressing down on that within day-to-day classroom reality is that teachers are not taking their kids out to play. And you're looking at schools, and I'm speaking as a mom and having been in the system for 6 years, watching and engaging with other schools. Schools where gym is one every 5 days or every 6 days for elementary school kids. Whereas in middle school at Cunningham, we might find gym 3 times a week. There's something wrong with that math ratio. So I'm just wondering how, and if you have serious conversations with other colleagues about shifting the balance back to the days when many of us grew up, where we had not only lunch, recess, and time to burn off some of this food, but we also had a second recess. And that has, as was mentioned, been erased for this generation. And the question is, I'm just wondering, where within the department run by the chancellor, there are serious conversations to ask principals to let children go out and play.
I know there are serious conversations, and it's just a really important subject matter. Recess and gym are important on many different levels. I think you have widespread acknowledgement of that within the department, not just from the simple act of burning off calories, but if you read Peg Tyer's book about the problem with boys, recess is important for the the academic achievement of what have historically been underachieving boys. So on many different levels, recess is critical, and it does play into food, although I'm not the person really to address the whole physical activity side because it's not my job. But I could tell you that one thing I have been involved with, and this is where everything gets very complicated, is when we went out with the new procurement for beverages and snacks, the money, the sponsorship money that we're going to use, and I should just say on the beverage side, we have very strict requirements. Essentially, the only thing that's going to be allowed
is water or seltzer type water. On the snack side, it's really constricted as well, and we've made great strides. We aren't immensely proud of that, although we realize it's a journey, not a destination. The money we've used, we started, for instance, a CHAMPS program during the 70s, during the budget cuts of the 70s, and middle school sports programs were eliminated. We brought them back. Luckily, even with our new requirements, the money that we received is significant enough to keep that going. Same thing with the PSAL, which is the High School Competitive League. With that money, the money that we've have gotten, which is not tax levy money, we've been able to create new sports. For instance, we created varsity cricket. We also created varsity double dutch, sports that don't exist in other cities, but ways of trying to bring in the number of kids involved in movement as a general concept to sort of higher levels. So it's a great question, and it's a complicated and important one.
I'm just let Jim finish up.
I'd add, not all these problems are solvable in a 6-hour school day. And if you look at the 8 or 9 hour school day and after school period or extended school day, depending on your dogma in that field, and as an opportunity to serve the kids healthy food, 3 meals a day, and I think it went by people, but part of the administration's proposal is to pay for a 3rd meal and after-school programs for school-age kids, which is wonderful, and have exercise during the school day and during after school, et cetera. The opportunities are there to do so much more on both the healthy eating and the exercise front if we get more kids into good after-school programs with good food.
And that's also part of child nutrition reauthorization.
Yes.
Well, great. Well, I can't thank everyone enough for coming today. So if Jan's book is for sale, you should by all means check it out. Free for All: Fixing School Food in America, and perhaps bend the ear of panelists if they're not running out the door.